Marcus Rivera knew what it felt like to be counted out before the fight even began. The widowed father of two, working double shifts at the copper refinery just to keep food on the table, watching his 12-year-old daughter Emma wear shoes held together with duct tape because new ones weren't in the budget. When his estranged great-uncle Silas died and left him a flooded mine shaft in the Colorado mountains, his wife's family laughed until they couldn't breathe. That fool left the broke Mexican a hole in the ground filled with water. His brother-in-law Derek sneered at the funeral reception. Probably costs more to pump out than it's worth. But Marcus was about to discover that sometimes what looks like a curse is actually a carefully disguised blessing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mine had been abandoned for 60 years, a relic from Colorado's silver boom that had supposedly played out decades ago. Local records showed it as worthless, flooded beyond recovery, a liability that would drain whatever savings Marcus didn't have. Everyone in Millfield knew the story. Silas Rivera had been the crazy old hermit who refused to give up on a dead mine, pumping water and chasing fool's gold until the day he died. What they didn't know was that Silas had discovered something in those depths that would change everything. Something worth $300 million that had been waiting in the darkness for the right person to claim it. The mountain town of Millfield, Colorado clung to life like moss on a rock face, sustained by stubbornness and the fading hope that the mines might someday produce again. Marcus Rivera had never intended to stay here, but life had a way of making decisions for you. He'd come to Millfield 15 years ago with Maria, his college sweetheart, drawn by a job at the copper refinery that promised steady work and mountain air for their future children. Those had been good years, when copper prices were high and the refinery ran 3 shifts. Marcus had been a supervisor then, respected for his engineering degree and his ability to solve problems that stumped men with twice his experience. He and Maria had bought a small house on Elm Street, with a garden where she grew vegetables and a workshop where he tinkered with old machinery. Emma was born in their 2nd year, followed by 8-year-old Diego 3 years later, and for a while it seemed like they were building the kind of life that existed in family photographs and Christmas cards. The cancer came without warning, the way it always does. One day Maria was complaining about being tired. The next she was in Denver undergoing chemotherapy that cost more than Marcus made in 6 months. The insurance covered some of it, but not the experimental treatments, not the extended hospital stays, not the 1,000 small expenses that accumulated like interest on a debt that could never be repaid. Marcus had sold everything they owned except the house, the truck, Maria's jewelry, his collection of antique tools, even Emma's piano that Maria had insisted they buy when their daughter showed musical talent. He'd taken a 2nd job driving a delivery truck on weekends, then a 3rd job cleaning offices at night. He'd borrowed against the house, maxed out credit cards, and swallowed his pride to ask Maria's family for help. The Hendersons had money, old Colorado mining money that stretched back 3 generations. Maria's father owned a construction company, and her brother Derek ran a successful real estate business. They'd never approved of Maria marrying a Hispanic man with no family connections and limited prospects, but they'd tolerated Marcus because Maria loved him and because his engineering degree suggested he might amount to something eventually. When Marcus came to them desperate for help with Maria's medical bills, they'd made their position clear. "We'll help," Maria's father had said, "but there are conditions. You sign over half the house as collateral, and when this is over, you move somewhere you can afford. Millfield isn't the right place for your children to grow up." Marcus had signed the papers because Maria needed the treatments. He would have signed away his soul if it meant giving her another chance at life. But the cancer had been stronger than their love, stronger than the doctors' expertise, stronger than every prayer and desperate bargain he'd offered to whatever God might be listening. Maria died on a Tuesday morning in November, holding Marcus's hand while snow fell outside the hospital window. Her last words were about the children, about making sure Emma kept playing music and that Diego learned Spanish so he wouldn't forget where his family came from. She'd made Marcus promise to fight for their life in Millfield, to not let her family push him into running away. That had been 3 years ago, and Marcus had kept his promise even as everything else fell apart. The copper refinery had cut his hours when global prices dropped. The second mortgage payments consumed most of his income. Emma had stopped asking for things she knew they couldn't afford, and Diego had learned to make his own lunch because Marcus often worked through the dinner hour. The Hendersons' disapproval had curdled into open hostility after Maria's death. They'd expected Marcus to take his children and leave Millfield quietly, maybe move to Denver where he could disappear into anonymity and they could pretend their daughter had never married beneath her station. When he'd stayed, determined to honor Maria's memory and maintain the only stable home his children had ever known, they'd made their displeasure known in dozens of small ways. Derek Henderson controlled most of the rental properties in Millfield, and he'd made sure Marcus knew that better housing would never be available to him. Maria's mother had Emma's school friends over for parties that Emma was never invited to. Subtle social exclusion that hurt more than outright cruelty. They'd challenged Marcus's custody of the children twice, hiring lawyers to argue that a single father working multiple jobs couldn't provide adequate care. Marcus had fought them each time, spending money he didn't have on legal fees, proving his fitness as a parent through court-ordered evaluations and social worker visits. He'd won, but the victories felt hollow when Emma came home from school asking why Grandma Henderson said she'd be better off living with people who could take proper care of her. Great-uncle Silas had been Marcus's only ally in the Henderson family, though ally was probably too strong a word. Silas Rivera was Maria's grandfather's brother, a man who'd shown up at family gatherings like an uncomfortable ghost, saying little and leaving early. He'd worked in the mines for 40 years before they played out, then spent another 20 trying to revive his own claim when everyone else had given up and moved on. The family had tolerated Silas because he was harmless, and because his eccentricities made for good stories. He lived alone in a cabin near his flooded mine, growing his own food and fixing his own equipment, appearing in town only when he needed supplies or medical attention. Children dared each other to approach his property, spinning tales about the crazy hermit who talked to rocks and believed there was still silver in played-out mountains. Marcus had encountered Silas perhaps a dozen times over the years, brief conversations at Maria's funeral and occasional nods when their paths crossed in the hardware store. Silas had never said much, but he'd been the only Henderson family member who'd looked Marcus in the eye with something approaching respect. At Maria's funeral, the old man had approached Marcus with surprising clarity and said, "She was the best of them. Don't let them break what she built." The news of Silas's death had come as a surprise, not because he'd died, but because anyone had noticed. A neighbor had found him in his cabin, apparently having passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 87. The funeral had been. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Sparsely attended, mostly Henderson family members fulfilling social obligations, and a few old-timers who remembered when Silas had been a respected member of the mining community. Marcus had attended out of respect for Maria's memory, bringing Emma and Diego because he wanted them to understand that family obligations didn't end with death. They'd stood at the graveside while the minister read generic words about eternal rest and divine mercy, and Marcus had wondered what Silas would have thought about the ceremony. The old man had been famously skeptical of organized religion, preferring what he called the honesty of stone and metal. The reading of Silas's will had been even more sparsely attended, just the immediate Henderson family and the lawyer, an elderly man named Theodore Walsh who'd apparently been handling Silas's affairs for decades. Marcus hadn't expected to be mentioned, so the sound of his own name had come as a complete shock. To Marcus Rivera, Walsh had read in his careful attorney's voice, "Husband of my great-niece Maria, I leave my mining claim and all associated property, including the cabin, equipment, and mineral rights." Marcus understands what it means to dig deep when others have given up. The silence in the lawyer's office had been deafening. Derek Henderson had been the first to recover, his face flushing red with indignation. "That's impossible. Silas wouldn't leave anything valuable to him. The mine's been flooded for decades, it's worthless." Nevertheless, Walsh had continued, the bequest is quite specific. Mr. Rivera is now the owner of the Esperanza mine and 40 acres of surrounding land. Marcus had barely heard the rest of the proceedings, his mind reeling with the implications. A mine, even a flooded one, represented responsibilities he couldn't afford. Property taxes, insurance, liability issues, the cost of maintaining equipment that probably hadn't run in years. It was a burden disguised as a gift, another weight added to shoulders already bearing more than they could carry. After the meeting, Derek had cornered Marcus in the parking lot, his usual veneer of civility completely abandoned. You think you're clever, don't you? Working on the old man, making him think you were family? Well, that mine is going to bankrupt you faster than Maria's medical bills did. The property taxes alone will eat up whatever savings you have left. I didn't ask for this, Marcus had replied, genuinely bewildered by Derek's hostility. I barely knew Silas. Sure you didn't? Just like you didn't marry my sister for her family connections. Derek's voice had carried the accumulated resentment of years of forced politeness. Well, congratulations, Marcus. You've inherited a hole in the ground that fills with water faster than you can pump it out. Hope it was worth whatever promises you made to a dying old man. That night, Marcus had sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the deed to property he'd never seen, trying to understand what Silas had been thinking. Emma had been practicing piano in the living room, her fingers finding melody lines in simplified arrangements of classical pieces. Diego had been at the table doing homework, occasionally asking for help with math problems that reminded Marcus of the engineering calculations he used to love. "Daddy, why is Uncle Derek mad about the mine?" Emma had asked during a break in her practice. At 12, she was old enough to understand family tensions, but young enough to believe they could be resolved with honest conversation. Sometimes adults disagree about what's best, Marcus had said, the kind of diplomatic non-answer that satisfied neither of them. Uncle Derek thinks the mine will be expensive to maintain. But Grandpa Silas left it to you for a reason, right? Diego had looked up from his homework with the kind of logical clarity that only 8-year-olds possessed. Maybe he knew something Uncle Derek doesn't know. Maybe he did, Marcus had thought, studying the legal documents that made him the owner of something he didn't understand. The property description included mineral rights, water rights, and access easements that suggested the claim was more complex than a simple hole in the ground. There were references to geological surveys and assay reports, technical language that hinted at serious analysis rather than casual prospecting. The next morning, Marcus had driven up the mountain road to see his inheritance for the first time. The Esperanza mine sat in a narrow valley about 15 miles outside Millfield, accessible by a dirt road that switchbacked up the mountainside through stands of aspen and pine. The elevation was nearly 10,000 feet, high enough that snow lingered in shaded areas even in late spring. Silas's cabin was smaller than Marcus had expected, a log structure with a metal roof and a stone chimney that looked hand-built. Solar panels on the roof and a small wind generator suggested the old man had been more technically sophisticated than his hermit reputation implied. A workshop building sat nearby, housing equipment that appeared to be well-maintained despite its age. The mine entrance was carved into the mountainside about 100 yards from the cabin, a tunnel that disappeared into darkness after just a few feet. Water stood in the entrance, black and still, reflecting the morning sky like a mirror. Posted signs warned of dangerous gases and unstable conditions. Liability warnings that made Marcus's stomach clench with anxiety. He'd stood at the water's edge, trying to imagine what Silas had seen in this place that kept him coming back for 20 years after everyone else had given up. The surrounding mountains showed evidence of extensive mining activity, scarred hillsides and abandoned equipment that spoke of Colorado's boom-and-bust mining history. But this particular claim seemed no different from dozens of others that had been abandoned when the easy ore played out. Walking through Silas's cabin had been like stepping into a life frozen in time. The furniture was simple but well-made, handcrafted pieces that showed the attention to detail of someone who valued quality over convenience. Books lined the walls, not just technical manuals about mining and geology, but literature and philosophy, suggesting depths to Silas's character that his hermit reputation had concealed. The kitchen held surprises too. Canned goods and preserved foods were organized with military precision, enough supplies to last months without a trip to town. A root cellar carved into the hillside contained vegetables and fruits that Silas had apparently grown himself, along with homebrewed beer and wine that showed sophistication in his self-sufficiency. But it was the office that had really surprised Marcus. Maps covered every wall, geological surveys and topographical charts marked with careful notations in Silas's precise handwriting. Binders full of technical reports filled file cabinets, assay results, and mineral analyses that dated back decades. A computer, more modern than Marcus would have expected, sat on a desk surrounded by printouts of geological data and mining industry reports. One map in particular had caught Marcus's attention. a hand-drawn chart of the mine's tunnels and shafts that showed much more extensive workings than the single flooded entrance suggested. According to Silas's notations, the mine extended nearly a quarter-mile into the mountain, with multiple levels and side tunnels that followed what appeared to be a complex ore body. Red X marks on the map indicated areas of particular interest, with notes about promising formations and unusual mineral deposits. One notation written in Silas's careful script had made Marcus's pulse quicken. Deep vein shows kimberlite indicators. Requires further analysis. Kimberlite was the geological formation that hosted diamond deposits, Marcus knew from his engineering training. It was rare in Colorado, more commonly found in South Africa and Canada. But if Silas had found kimberlite indicators in his mine, it would explain why he'd never given up on a claim that everyone else considered worthless. Marcus had photographed the maps and documents, intending to research their implications when he had access to geological databases. But as he prepared to leave the cabin, a sound had stopped him cold. The distant rumble of a diesel engine, coming up the mountain road at higher speed than the rough conditions should have allowed. He'd stepped outside to see a convoy of vehicles approaching, led by a white pickup truck with Henderson Construction logos on the doors. Derek Henderson climbed out of the lead vehicle, followed by 3 men in work clothes and a woman in a business suit who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. "Well, well," Derek had said, his voice carrying across the narrow valley. "Look who's come to inspect his empire. Hope you brought your checkbook, Marcus, because you're going to need it." The woman had introduced herself as Janet Morrison from the county assessor's office, explaining that she was there to conduct an updated property valuation for tax purposes. The men with Derek were apparently contractors, brought to assess the cost of bringing the property up to current safety and environmental standards. The county's been waiting for Silas to die so they could deal with this liability, Derek had explained with satisfaction. Abandoned mines require environmental remediation, safety improvements, proper closure procedures. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in mandatory upgrades. Morrison had been more diplomatic, but no less discouraging. "Mr. Rivera, I need to inform you that inheriting this property comes with significant obligations. The mine entrance needs to be properly sealed. The water requires environmental testing, and there are liability issues related to public access. The county is prepared to help you understand your options." Marcus had listened to their explanations with growing dread, understanding that his inheritance was exactly what Derek had predicted, a financial burden that would complete his family's economic destruction. The environmental remediation alone would cost more than his house was worth, and the ongoing liability insurance would consume income he couldn't spare. But as the officials had conducted their inspection, Marcus had found himself thinking about Silas's maps, about the kimberlite notations and the extensive underground workings that no one else seemed to know about. The old man had spent 20 years working this claim, after everyone else had given up. He'd lived alone in the mountains, investing his own time and money in a project that everyone considered hopeless. Why would a rational man do that, unless he knew something others didn't? That night, Marcus had returned to Silas's cabin alone, driving up the mountain road after Emma and Diego had gone to bed. He brought a flashlight and basic tools, intending to examine the mine entrance more carefully than the official inspection had allowed. The water at the tunnel mouth was about 4 feet deep, cold enough to take his breath away when he'd waded in. But the tunnel was larger than it appeared from the surface, carved through solid rock with the kind of precision that suggested serious engineering rather than casual prospecting. About 20 feet into the tunnel, Marcus had found something that made his heart race. A side passage, barely visible above the waterline, that led into workings not shown on any of the official surveys. Silas had apparently continued mining long after the main tunnel had flooded, accessing deeper levels through passages that remained dry. Following the side passage with his flashlight, Marcus had discovered a complex network of tunnels and chambers that stretched deep into the mountain. The air was stale but breathable, suggesting ventilation systems that Silas had maintained even after the mine's official closure. Electric cables ran along the tunnel walls, leading to work areas equipped with drilling equipment and ore processing machinery. But it was what he'd found in the deepest chamber that had changed everything. A vein of rock unlike anything in the surrounding granite, bluish-green stone that showed the distinctive characteristics of kimberlite formation. Silas had been following this vein for years, carefully extracting samples and analyzing their content with equipment that rivaled what Marcus had seen in professional laboratories. And scattered throughout the kimberlite, catching the flashlight beam like captured stars, were crystals that could only be diamonds. Not the massive stones of Hollywood fantasy, but real diamonds nonetheless. Some as large as Marcus's thumbnail, embedded in rock that Silas had been systematically extracting and processing. Marcus had spent 3 hours in those tunnels, following the vein through chambers that Silas had carved with painstaking care. The old man had been working alone, using hand tools and small explosives to follow the diamond-bearing formation wherever it led. According to the careful records he'd kept, posted on tunnel walls like mining claims, the vein extended at least another quarter-mile into the mountain. The implications were staggering. If even a fraction of the formation contained diamonds of gem quality, the value would be measured in millions rather than thousands. Silas hadn't been a crazy hermit chasing impossible dreams. He'd been a methodical prospector following a legitimate discovery that could transform not just Marcus's life, but the entire economy of Millfield. But as Marcus had made his way back through the tunnels, he'd begun to understand why Silas had kept his discovery secret. Diamond mining required massive capital investment, environmental permits that took years to obtain, and political connections that a hermit prospector could never develop. The discovery would attract attention from mining companies with resources to overwhelm any individual claim holder, corporations that would find ways to tie up the property in legal challenges while they maneuvered for control. Silas had faced a choice: reveal his discovery and lose control of it, or keep working quietly while he figured out how to develop the claim without outside interference. He'd chosen secrecy, spending his final years preparing for a transfer to someone who might have the strength and resources to fight for the discovery he'd spent his life making. By leaving the mine to Marcus, Silas had passed on more than property. He'd handed over a secret worth hundreds of millions of dollars, along with the responsibility to protect it from those who would exploit it without regard for the community that had sheltered the old prospector for so many years. Marcus had emerged from the mine as dawn was breaking over the mountains, his mind racing with possibilities and dangers in equal measure. He now owned what might be the richest diamond deposit ever discovered in Colorado, but he also faced enemies who would stop at nothing to take it away from him. The question was whether a broke widower with 2 children and a mortgage he couldn't afford had the strength to honor Silas's trust and fight for a treasure that could save his family or destroy it completely. As he'd driven back down the mountain toward Millfield, Marcus had noticed another vehicle following him at a distance, maintaining just enough separation to avoid detection. Someone was already watching him, already wondering what had brought him to the mine so early in the morning. The battle for the Esperanza mine was about to begin, and Marcus was far from certain he was strong enough to win it. The phone rang at 6 in the morning, jolting Marcus from the first decent sleep he'd managed in weeks. The caller ID showed Henderson Construction, and Marcus felt his stomach clench with familiar dread. Derek's voice carried the smug satisfaction of someone who'd been planning this conversation for days. "Morning, Marcus. Hope I didn't wake you, but I've got some news you need to hear. The county environmental assessment came back, and it's worse than we thought. Looks like you're sitting on a Superfund site." Marcus sat up in bed, instantly alert. Environmental contamination was every property owner's nightmare, the kind of liability that could destroy families for generations. "What are you talking about?" "Heavy metals, chemical contamination from decades of mining operations. The water in that mine shaft is toxic enough to kill fish downstream, and the county's holding you responsible for cleanup. We're talking about $2, maybe $3 million in remediation costs." The number hit Marcus like a physical blow. $3 million might as well have been $3 billion for all the chance he had of paying it. Derek knew exactly what he was doing, using environmental regulations as a weapon to force Marcus into bankruptcy and surrender the mine to people with deeper pockets. "There's a way out, though," Derek continued, his voice taking on the false sympathy that Marcus had learned to distrust completely. "I've got investors interested in taking the property off your hands. They'll assume all the environmental liability and pay you enough to relocate somewhere more suitable for your family. Clean slate, fresh start." Marcus recognized the offer for what it was, another attempt by the Henderson family to control him through financial pressure. They'd used the same tactics after Maria's death, offering help that came with strings attached. assistance that transformed the recipient into a dependent rather than an equal. "I'll need to see the environmental report myself," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. "And I'll want a second opinion on the cleanup requirements." Derek's laugh carried no warmth. "Sure, Marcus, spend money you don't have on lawyers and consultants. Just remember that every day you wait, the cleanup costs go higher and your legal liability gets deeper. The county's not going to wait forever for you to accept reality." After Derek hung up, Marcus sat in his dark bedroom, trying to process the implications of what he'd heard. If the environmental assessment was accurate, the mine really was a liability that would destroy his family's future. But something about Derek's eagerness to share the bad news made Marcus suspicious. The Henderson family had never shown concern for his welfare before, and their sudden interest in helping him escape his problems felt more like a trap than genuine assistance. Emma appeared in the kitchen as Marcus was making coffee, her hair still tousled from sleep, but her eyes alert with the kind of intelligence that reminded him painfully of Maria. At 12, she'd learned to read the signs of her father's stress, to gauge the severity of family crises by the tightness around his eyes and the way he held his shoulders. "Bad news?" she asked, settling at the kitchen table with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children develop when their lives are regularly disrupted by adult problems. "Maybe," Marcus said, not wanting to burden her with worries she couldn't help solve. "Some complications with the mine Uncle Derek thinks might be expensive to fix." Emma poured herself a glass of orange juice with careful precision, a ritual that gave her time to think. "Uncle Derek always thinks things are expensive when they don't benefit him. Remember when he said fixing our roof would cost more than the house was worth? Then Mr. Gonzalez did it for $300? Marcus smiled despite his worries. Emma's ability to cut through adult deception with childlike clarity was both blessing and burden, providing insight he needed while exposing her to harsh realities no 12-year-old should have to consider. Diego joined them a few minutes later, still in pajamas but carrying the backpack that contained his most treasured possessions, a collection of rocks and minerals he'd been gathering since he was old enough to walk. His fascination with geology had started as typical childhood curiosity about shiny objects, but had evolved into genuine knowledge that sometimes surprised adults who didn't expect scientific literacy from an 8-year-old. "Are we going to see the mine today?" Diego asked, spreading his rock collection across the kitchen table with the enthusiasm of a curator displaying prized artifacts. "I want to see what kind of formations Uncle Silas was working on." Marcus hesitated. Taking the children to the mine would expose them to whatever dangers had prompted the environmental warnings, but it would also allow Diego's geological knowledge to help evaluate Silas's discovery. An 8-year-old's observations might provide insights that adult experts would miss, especially if those experts were working for people with agendas that didn't include protecting Marcus's interests. "We'll see," Marcus said, the parental non-answer that bought time while he considered options. "First, I need to do some research about mining safety and environmental regulations." The Millfield Public Library opened at 9, and Marcus was waiting when the librarian unlocked the doors. Sarah Chen had been the head librarian for 15 years, transforming a modest small-town facility into a research center that rivaled much larger institutions. She'd known Maria well, had grieved genuinely at the funeral, and had been one of the few community members who'd offered Marcus practical help, rather than empty condolences. "Environmental mining law," Sarah repeated when Marcus explained what he needed. "That's a specialized area, but we should be able to access the relevant databases through the state university system." "Are you dealing with regulatory issues at Silas's mine?" Marcus outlined the morning's phone call from Derek, watching Sarah's expression grow increasingly skeptical as he described the supposed environmental contamination and cleanup requirements. She'd lived in Millfield long enough to understand local politics, to recognize when environmental concerns were being weaponized for economic advantage. "That's interesting," she said when Marcus finished his account. "Because I helped Silas research environmental compliance issues just 6 months ago. He was very concerned about meeting all the regulatory requirements, spent considerable time and money on water testing and soil analysis." Sarah led Marcus to a computer terminal connected to the university's geological databases, pulling up records that Silas had apparently filed with multiple state agencies. The documentation painted a picture of a man who'd been scrupulously careful about environmental protection, conducting regular testing and maintaining detailed records of all mining activities. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a series of water quality reports that Silas had submitted quarterly for the past 5 years. These show contamination levels well below regulatory thresholds. If there was significant environmental damage, it would have appeared in these tests. Marcus studied the reports, noting the professional quality of the analysis and the consistency of the results. Silas hadn't been the careless hermit that local reputation suggested. He'd been conducting mining operations with the kind of scientific rigor that indicated both technical knowledge and substantial financial resources. "There's more," Sarah continued, pulling up geological surveys that Silas had commissioned from the Colorado School of Mines. These are expensive analyses, the kind that major mining companies order when they're evaluating significant deposits. Whatever Silas was working on, he was taking it very seriously. The geological surveys were revelation after revelation. Professional geologists had identified multiple mineral formations in the Esperanza mine, including rare earth elements and precious metal deposits that extended far beyond the simple silver claim that local records indicated. But buried in the technical language was a notation that made Marcus's pulse quicken. Anomalous carbon formations suggest possible diamond-bearing kimberlite intrusion. Recommend further investigation. Professional geologists had confirmed what Marcus had discovered in the deep tunnels. Silas's mine wasn't just a played-out silver claim. It was a complex geological formation that might contain one of the richest diamond deposits ever discovered in North America. "Sarah," Marcus said carefully, "if someone wanted to force a property owner into selling mining rights, what would be the most effective legal strategy?" Sarah's expression grew serious. "Environmental liability is the nuclear option. If you can prove contamination that threatens public health, you can force immediate remediation or property seizure. It's been used to acquire valuable properties at below-market prices, especially when the current owner lacks resources to fight lengthy legal battles." Marcus felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Derek's eagerness to share bad environmental news. His immediate offer to connect Marcus with investors who would assume all liability. The convenient timing of an assessment that contradicted Silas's careful documentation. Someone was orchestrating a campaign to force Marcus off the property before he could discover what Silas had spent years developing. "I need to see that environmental report," Marcus said, "and I need to understand who ordered the assessment and what their real agenda might be." Sarah nodded grimly. Environmental law is complex, but it's also subject to political pressure. If someone with influence wants a particular outcome, they can usually find regulatory justification for it. The question is whether you're prepared to fight people with resources you don't have. Marcus thought about Emma wearing shoes held together with duct tape, about Diego's collection of rocks that represented the only luxury his children could afford, about Maria's deathbed request that he fight for their life in Millfield. "I don't have much choice. This mine might be the only chance my family has for a real future." The environmental report, when Marcus finally obtained a copy through Sarah's persistence and legal research skills, was a masterpiece of selective presentation. The document focused exclusively on contamination in the flooded main tunnel, ignoring the extensive clean areas that Silas had been working for years. Water samples had been taken from the most polluted areas, with no acknowledgement of the environmental controls that Silas had installed in the active mining zones. Most damning was the authorship of the report. ChemAnalysis Solutions was a Denver-based consulting firm that specialized in environmental assessments for development projects. According to their website, their clients included major real estate developers and mining corporations looking to acquire properties with mineral potential. "This isn't a genuine environmental assessment," Marcus told Sarah after reviewing the methodology. "It's a legal document designed to create justification for property seizure. They're using selective data to paint the worst possible picture." Sarah had been researching ChemAnalysis Solutions while Marcus studied the report, and what she'd discovered confirmed his suspicions. They've been involved in at least 12 property acquisitions over the past 5 years, always finding environmental problems that require immediate intervention by their clients. It's a business model based on regulatory intimidation. Marcus felt anger building, the kind of righteous fury that Maria used to say was his greatest strength and weakness. Someone was trying to steal his children's future, using environmental regulations as a weapon, confident that he lacked the knowledge and resources to fight back effectively. "What would it take to challenge this report?" he asked. "Independent environmental assessment, legal representation, and enough money to sustain a fight that could last years," Sarah replied. "The people behind this have deep pockets and political connections. They're counting on you not being able to afford a real battle." That afternoon, Marcus drove back to the Esperanza mine with Diego, deciding that his son's geological knowledge might provide insights that professional consultants would miss. The boy had been studying mineralogy with the intensity that other children devoted to video games, accumulating knowledge that impressed college professors when Marcus had taken him to university open houses. "Look at the rock formations," Diego said as they hiked from the cabin to the mine entrance. "The granite shows mineral intrusion patterns that suggest multiple geological events." Uncle Silas wasn't just following one vein, he was tracking an entire complex of different deposits. Marcus watched his 8-year-old son examine rock samples with the methodical approach of a trained scientist, noting color variations and crystal structures that suggested valuable mineral content. Diego's enthusiasm was infectious, but it also highlighted the stakes of the battle Marcus was facing. If he lost the mine, he'd be stealing his son's geological wonderland along with his family's financial future. They spent 2 hours exploring the accessible tunnels, with Diego cataloging samples and Marcus photographing areas that contradicted the environmental report's dire claims. The active mining zones showed clear evidence of Silas's environmental controls, proper ventilation, water management systems, and waste containment that exceeded regulatory requirements. "Daddy," Diego said as they prepared to leave, "the water contamination is only in the old tunnel where they stopped working years ago. The places where Uncle Silas was really mining, they're cleaner than the creek behind our house." Marcus realized that his 8-year-old son had identified the central deception in the environmental report. The contamination was real, but it was limited to abandoned areas that hadn't been worked in decades. Silas's actual mining operations had been conducted with environmental controls that would satisfy any reasonable regulatory review. That evening, Marcus called attorney Jennifer Walsh, who had handled Silas's estate and might have insights into the old man's legal preparations. Walsh agreed to meet the next morning, warning that her knowledge of mining law was limited, but expressing willingness to help Marcus understand his options. Walsh's law office occupied the second floor of a Victorian house in downtown Millfield, a setting that suggested small-town practice rather than high-stakes corporate litigation. But when Marcus arrived for their meeting, he found Walsh surrounded by mining law textbooks and environmental regulations, clearly having spent considerable time researching the issues Marcus faced. "I've been reviewing Silas's papers," she said without preamble, "and I think you need to understand what you're really dealing with. Silas didn't just leave you a mine. He left you a legal time bomb that's been carefully prepared to explode in very specific circumstances." Walsh spread documents across her conference table, showing Marcus the complex web of legal protections that Silas had constructed around his mining claim. Environmental insurance policies, mineral rights documentation, and correspondence with state agencies painted a picture of a man who'd been preparing for exactly the kind of assault Marcus was now facing. Silas knew someone would try to use environmental regulations to force a property seizure, Walsh continued. "He's documented every aspect of his mining operations, maintained insurance coverage that protects against environmental liability, and established legal precedents that should prevent regulatory intimidation." Marcus studied the documentation, noting the professional quality of legal preparation that suggested Silas had been working with attorneys far more sophisticated than small-town practitioners. "Why didn't he fight these battles himself? Why wait to transfer the property to me?" Walsh's expression grew somber. "Because he knew that fighting this battle would require someone with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Silas was an old man with no family and limited time. You're a father fighting for his children's future. That makes you much more dangerous to people who are used to getting what they want." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on Walsh's office door. Her secretary announced that Marcus had visitors downstairs, men in expensive suits who'd identified themselves as representatives of Apex Mining Consortium. Walsh and Marcus exchanged glances, both understanding that the real battle was about to begin. The 3 men waiting in Walsh's reception area looked like they'd been ordered from a corporate casting agency, perfectly groomed, expensively dressed, and carrying themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to getting their way through a combination of money and intimidation. The lead man introduced himself as Richard Vaughn, Senior Acquisition Specialist for Apex Mining. "Mr. Rivera," Vaughn said, extending a manicured hand that had never held a mining tool, "we understand you've inherited some challenging property from your late uncle. Apex specializes in helping families deal with exactly these kinds of situations." Marcus accepted the handshake while studying Vaughn's face for signs of deception. The man's smile was professional but cold, the expression of someone who viewed other people as obstacles to be overcome, rather than human beings deserving respect. "We're prepared to make you a very generous offer," Vaughn continued, pulling out a leather portfolio. $5 million for the complete mineral rights to the Esperanza mine, with Apex assuming all environmental liability and cleanup costs. You'd be free to relocate your family anywhere you choose, with enough money to ensure your children's future education and security. The number was staggering, more money than Marcus had ever imagined possessing. $5 million would solve every financial problem his family faced, would give Emma and Diego opportunities that extended far beyond Millfield's limited horizons. But something about Vaughn's eagerness to close the deal immediately made Marcus suspicious. "That's a substantial offer," Marcus said carefully. "I'd need time to consider the implications and consult with my attorney." Vaughn's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, though I should mention that environmental cleanup costs tend to escalate rapidly once regulatory agencies become involved. The longer you wait, the more expensive your liability becomes. Apex is prepared to close this transaction within 48 hours, assuming you're willing to be reasonable about the terms." Attorney Walsh had remained silent during the exchange, but Marcus could see her taking careful notes of the conversation. When Vaughn and his associates left, promising to follow up within 24 hours, she immediately began researching Apex Mining Consortium. "Interesting company," she said after 20 minutes of computer searches. Apex was incorporated just 18 months ago, but their corporate structure suggests connections to much larger mining operations. They've acquired mineral rights to over 50 properties in Colorado, always using the same strategy: environmental pressure followed by immediate cash offers. Marcus felt the familiar pattern of manipulation that had characterized his dealings with the Henderson family. Powerful interests using regulatory pressure to force weaker parties into surrendering valuable assets, confident that their targets lacked the resources to fight effectively. $5 million is a lot of money, Walsh observed. But if they're willing to pay that much immediately, the property is probably worth significantly more. The question is whether you're prepared to risk everything to find out how much more. That night, Marcus sat in Silas's cabin with Diego and Emma, trying to help his children understand the choice their family faced. The mine's geological complexity fascinated Diego, while Emma was drawn to the historical significance of Silas's long struggle to develop his discovery. Both children seemed to understand instinctively that accepting Apex's offer would mean surrendering something more valuable than money. "Uncle Silas worked on this for 20 years, Emma said, studying the maps and geological reports that covered the cabin walls. "If we sell it now, all his work was for nothing." Diego was examining rock samples with a magnifying glass, noting mineral characteristics that suggested valuable deposits throughout the mountain. "Daddy, these formations extend way beyond what the maps show." Uncle Silas was following veins that could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Marcus realized that his children had grasped the central issue more clearly than the adults who were pressuring him to sell. This wasn't just about money, though the financial stakes were enormous. It was about honoring the vision of a man who'd spent his life believing that patient work and careful stewardship could create something valuable for future generations. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Sarah Chen called from the library with information she'd discovered in state geological databases, records that painted a dramatically different picture of the Esperanza mine's potential value. "Marcus, you need to get down here immediately," Sarah said, her voice tight with excitement. "I've found geological surveys that were filed with the state but somehow never made it into the public databases. Silas discovered something that makes Apex's $5 million offer look like pocket change." Marcus drove to the library with a sense of anticipation that bordered on dread. He'd learned to be suspicious of good news, especially when it came from sources outside his family's direct control. But Sarah's research had always been reliable, and her excitement suggested she'd uncovered something genuinely significant. The documents Sarah had located told a story that explained everything about the battle Marcus was facing. Professional geological surveys, commissioned by Silas and filed with multiple state agencies, confirmed the presence of diamond-bearing kimberlite formations throughout the Esperanza mine. But more importantly, they estimated the deposit's value at over $300 million, making it potentially the richest diamond discovery in Colorado's history. This explains why Apex is so eager to acquire your mineral rights, Sarah said, spreading survey maps across the library table. They've obviously seen these reports and understand that $5 million is a fraction of what the property is actually worth. Marcus studied the geological projections, trying to comprehend numbers that seemed to belong in fantasy rather than reality. $300 million would transform not just his family's future, but the entire economic foundation of Millfield. The mining operation would create hundreds of jobs, generate tax revenue that could rebuild the community's infrastructure, and establish Colorado as a significant player in the global diamond market. But realizing the potential would require surviving the assault that Apex and their allies were mounting against his ownership of the mine. Environmental regulations, legal challenges, and political pressure would intensify as the stakes became clear. Marcus was no longer fighting for his family's survival, he was fighting for control of a treasure that powerful interests would kill to possess. The battle for the Esperanza mine was about to escalate into a war that would test everything Marcus had learned about perseverance, courage, and the price of standing up to people who believed that money could buy anything they wanted. As he left the library with copies of the geological surveys, Marcus noticed the same vehicle that had followed him from the mine days earlier, maintaining careful distance but clearly tracking his movements. Someone was watching him closely, gathering intelligence about his activities and preparing for whatever came next. Marcus drove home through Millfield's quiet streets, noting how many houses showed for sale signs and how many businesses had closed since the copper refinery cut operations. The town was dying slowly, bleeding jobs and young people to larger cities that offered better opportunities. The Esperanza mine could reverse that decline, could give Millfield the economic foundation it needed to rebuild and thrive. But first, Marcus had to survive long enough to develop Silas's discovery, had to outfight enemies with resources and connections that dwarfed anything a broke widower could bring to the battle. The next few weeks would determine whether David could defeat Goliath when the stakes were hundreds of millions of dollars and the future of an entire community. The attack came at dawn on a Tuesday morning, swift and coordinated like a military operation. Marcus woke to the sound of diesel engines and heavy machinery converging on his property from multiple directions. Through his bedroom window, he could see county vehicles, environmental response teams, and what appeared to be private security contractors setting up a perimeter around his house. A bullhorn crackled to life in the gray morning air. "Marcus Rivera, this is County Environmental Enforcement. We have a court order requiring immediate evacuation of contaminated property. You have 30 minutes to gather essential belongings before the area is declared a hazardous zone." Marcus threw on clothes and rushed to wake Emma and Diego, his mind racing with the implications of what was happening. Someone had obtained emergency court orders in the middle of the night, bypassing normal legal procedures to create a crisis that would force him off his property before he could mount an effective defense. Emma appeared in the hallway already dressed, her face pale but determined. "I packed our important papers last night," she said quietly. "I heard trucks moving around town and thought something like this might happen." Diego emerged from his room carrying his rock collection and a backpack full of geological samples from the mine. At 8 years old, he understood that they were under attack and that his father needed every advantage they could gather. The family had rehearsed this scenario during the past week, planning for the possibility that their enemies would use emergency powers to force an immediate confrontation. Attorney Walsh had warned them that environmental enforcement actions could be executed with minimal judicial oversight, especially when public safety was allegedly at stake. Marcus gathered the legal documents that Silas had prepared, the geological surveys that proved the mine's value, and the insurance policies that should protect against environmental liability. Everything else would have to be left behind, sacrificed to bureaucratic warfare designed to leave him defenseless and desperate. The evacuation proceeded with military efficiency, county officials treating Marcus and his children like potential criminals rather than property owners exercising their legal rights. Environmental teams in hazmat suits made a show of testing air quality and soil contamination, their dramatic protective equipment suggesting dangers that required immediate government intervention. But Marcus noticed details that contradicted the emergency narrative. The environmental crews were focusing their activities on areas visible to news cameras, while ignoring zones that would actually pose health risks if contamination were genuine. The whole operation felt choreographed for maximum visual impact rather than legitimate safety concerns. County Commissioner Janet Morrison arrived as the evacuation was completing, her official vehicle followed by news vans from Denver television stations. Someone had alerted the media in advance, ensuring that Marcus's displacement would be broadcast across Colorado as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unregulated mining operations. "Mr. Rivera," Morrison said, approaching with a legal document, "I'm serving you with notice that the Esperanza mine and associated properties are being placed under county environmental protection pending comprehensive remediation. All access is prohibited until contamination levels meet federal safety standards." Marcus accepted the document while studying Morrison's face for signs of genuine concern versus political calculation. The commissioner's expression suggested someone following a script rather than responding to a real emergency. "Commissioner, I have environmental insurance that covers any legitimate cleanup costs," Marcus said, pulling out Silas's policy documents. "These orders seem premature, given that no independent assessment has confirmed the contamination claims." Morrison barely glanced at the insurance papers. "Mr. Rivera, public safety takes precedence over private insurance arrangements. The county has a responsibility to protect citizens from environmental hazards, regardless of property ownership issues." Behind Morrison, Marcus could see Derek Henderson talking animatedly with men in expensive suits, their body language suggesting celebration rather than concern. The environmental crisis was proceeding exactly as someone had planned, with Marcus being displaced before he could organize effective resistance. Attorney Walsh arrived as the county crews were installing barriers around the property, her face grim with the knowledge that they were fighting a battle designed to be unwinnable. Emergency environmental orders were almost impossible to challenge quickly, requiring weeks or months of legal proceedings while the targeted property remained under government control. "They've outmaneuvered us," Walsh said quietly as they watched officials seal access routes to the mine. "Emergency powers allow them to act first and justify later. By the time we can challenge these orders, they'll have accomplished whatever they're really trying to do." Marcus felt despair settling over him like a physical weight. Everything Silas had worked for, everything his family needed for their future, was being stolen through legal manipulation that he lacked the resources to fight effectively. The system was designed to protect people with money and connections, not working families facing bureaucratic warfare. But Emma had been listening to the adult conversation with the intense focus that she brought to difficult problems. "Daddy," she said, tugging on his sleeve, "what if the environmental problems aren't real? What if someone is lying to the county officials?" Marcus knelt to his daughter's level, struck by the clarity of her question. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Uncle Derek keeps talking to those men in suits like they're celebrating something. If people were really in danger, wouldn't they be worried instead of happy?" Out of the mouths of babes, Emma had identified the central deception that adult authorities had either missed or chosen to ignore. The environmental emergency was theater, designed to create legal justification for seizing valuable property from someone who lacked political influence. Walsh had been making phone calls while Emma and Marcus talked, and her expression had brightened considerably. "Marcus, I may have found something." The emergency court order was issued by Judge Harrison, who sits on the board of directors for Mountain Development Corporation. That's a clear conflict of interest that could invalidate the entire proceeding. Marcus felt a spark of hope for the first time since the evacuation began. Legal conflicts of interest were serious matters that even corrupt officials had to acknowledge when properly documented. If they could prove that the judge had financial incentives to rule against Marcus, the environmental orders might be overturned. "There's more," Walsh continued, checking her notes. "Mountain Development Corporation is a subsidiary of Henderson Industries, which means Derek has been manipulating the legal system to acquire your property. That's fraud and abuse of process." The pieces of the conspiracy were falling into place with crystalline clarity. Derek Henderson had orchestrated the environmental crisis, using his political connections to obtain emergency orders that would force Marcus off valuable property. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Create a legal emergency that bypassed normal judicial protections, then acquire the targeted assets while the owner was prevented from defending himself. But exposing the conspiracy would require more than just documentation. Marcus needed evidence that would convince other judges, media outlets, and political officials that the environmental crisis was fabricated. That meant getting back into the mine to document the actual conditions, regardless of county orders prohibiting access. "I need to get back to the mine tonight," Marcus told Walsh. If we can document that the environmental contamination claims are false, we can expose the whole conspiracy. Walsh looked alarmed. Marcus, violating the court order could result in criminal charges. Even if we ultimately prove the order was invalid, you could face jail time for contempt of court. Marcus thought about Emma's observation that the supposed emergency responders were celebrating rather than showing concern for public safety. His 12-year-old daughter had cut through adult deception to identify the truth that everyone else was either missing or ignoring. If I don't take this risk, my children lose their future, and Silas's life work gets stolen by people who care nothing about the community he was trying to help, Marcus said. Sometimes the legal system fails, and ordinary people have to stand up for what's right. That evening, Marcus drove to the mine using back roads that avoided county checkpoints. Accompanied by Diego and a digital camera capable of documenting environmental conditions in detail. If he was going to risk criminal charges, the evidence he gathered needed to be compelling enough to justify the gamble. The mine entrance was now surrounded by yellow tape and warning signs, but the actual security presence was minimal. Whoever had ordered the evacuation was counting on legal intimidation rather than physical barriers to keep Marcus away from his property. Diego proved to be an invaluable ally in documenting the environmental deception. His knowledge of geology allowed him to identify areas where contamination should be present if the county's claims were accurate, while his small size allowed him to access tunnels that adult inspectors couldn't reach. "Daddy, look at this," Diego said, pointing to water samples they'd collected from different areas of the mine. "The clean zones are much bigger than the contaminated areas. Uncle Silas was working in parts of the mine that meet all the environmental standards." Marcus photographed everything: clean water flowing through Silas's active mining areas, properly installed environmental controls, and contamination limited to abandoned sections that hadn't been worked in decades. The evidence clearly showed that the environmental crisis was based on selective reporting that ignored the majority of the mine's actual conditions. But the most damning discovery came when Diego found discarded documents near the mine entrance, apparently dropped by environmental crews during their hasty setup. The papers included internal communications between Chemanalysis Solutions and Apex Mining, discussing strategies for creating regulatory pressure that would force property transfer. "This is conspiracy to defraud," Marcus said, photographing the documents with trembling hands. "They're admitting that the environmental assessment was designed to steal the property rather than protect public safety." The evidence was overwhelming, but presenting it would require surviving the legal and political pressure that would intensify once Marcus's nighttime documentation became public. Powerful interests had invested substantial resources in acquiring the Esperanza mine, and they wouldn't surrender their investment without a fight that could destroy anyone who opposed them. The next morning brought an unexpected ally in the form of investigative journalist Catherine Walsh, no relation to Attorney Walsh but equally committed to exposing corruption in Colorado's mining industry. She'd been researching Apex Mining's acquisition strategies when Marcus's case caught her attention, and the environmental enforcement action had raised red flags about regulatory manipulation. "I've been tracking Apex for 6 months," Catherine explained when she met with Marcus at a coffee shop in the neighboring town of Silverton. "They've used the same environmental pressure tactics to acquire mineral rights across Colorado, always targeting properties that show geological promise." Catherine had documentation that painted a disturbing picture of systematic corruption involving mining companies, regulatory officials, and local politicians. The Esperanza mine case was just the latest example of a pattern that had been operating for years, stealing valuable properties from families who lacked the resources to fight back effectively. "The difference is that you have evidence of the conspiracy," Catherine continued, reviewing Marcus's photographs and documents. "If we can get this story published in the Denver Post, it could expose the entire network and force state officials to intervene. But going public would also escalate the conflict beyond anything Marcus had faced before. Corporate interests with hundreds of millions at stake would use every weapon available to destroy his credibility and silence his accusations. The battle would become national news, with his family's future hanging in the balance of public opinion and political calculation." Emma and Diego had been listening to the adult conversation with the careful attention they'd learned to pay when their father's struggles threatened their family's stability. But instead of showing fear, both children displayed determination that reminded Marcus painfully of Maria's courage during her final battle with cancer. "Daddy," Emma said quietly, "if we don't fight them, they'll just do this to other families. Uncle Silas left you the mine because he knew you wouldn't let bad people win. Diego nodded agreement, his 8-year-old face serious with purpose. The geological evidence proves they're lying. Truth is stronger than money if people know what to look for. Marcus realized that his children understood something that many adults missed. The battle for the Esperanza mine was bigger than their family's financial future. It was about whether ordinary people could stand up to systematic corruption, whether truth could triumph over money and political influence. Catherine's article appeared in the Denver Post 3 days later, complete with Marcus's photographs and copies of the conspiracy documents. The headline read, "Environmental Laws Used to Steal $1 Million Mining Claims," and the story detailed how Apex Mining had manipulated regulatory agencies to acquire valuable properties at below-market prices. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Environmental groups denounced the abuse of protective regulations for corporate profit. Mining industry associations condemned the corruption that damaged their sector's reputation. Political officials scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal while promising investigations and reforms. But the corporate response was equally swift and vicious. Apex Mining hired the state's most expensive law firm to file defamation suits against Marcus and Catherine Walsh. Private investigators began digging into Marcus's personal history, looking for any ammunition that could be used to destroy his credibility. Political pressure mounted on county officials to defend their environmental enforcement actions. The battle reached its climax when the Colorado Attorney General announced a formal investigation into the Esperanza mine case, with federal environmental officials joining the probe. Emergency court orders were suspended pending the investigation's outcome, allowing Marcus to return to his property for the first time in 2 weeks. What he found there shocked him even more than the original conspiracy. In his absence, unauthorized personnel had attempted to access the deep mining tunnels where Silas had discovered the diamond-bearing formations. Fresh excavation marks showed that someone had been trying to extract samples from the most valuable areas, probably hoping to establish their own claims to the mineral deposits. They were trying to steal the diamonds while keeping us away with fake environmental orders, Diego observed, examining the unauthorized digging with geological expertise that impressed the federal investigators who'd arrived to document the site. The federal investigation proceeded with methodical thoroughness, uncovering evidence of corruption that extended far beyond the Esperanza mine case. Apex Mining's pattern of regulatory manipulation had affected dozens of properties across multiple states, representing a systematic fraud that had cost property owners hundreds of millions of dollars. Judge Harrison was removed from the bench pending criminal investigation. Derek Henderson was arrested on charges of conspiracy and fraud. Chemanalysis Solutions lost its environmental consulting licenses and faced federal prosecution for falsifying regulatory reports. But the victory that mattered most to Marcus came when independent geological surveys confirmed what Silas had spent 20 years documenting. The Esperanza mine contained diamond deposits worth over $300 million, making it one of the richest discoveries in North American mining history. The development of the mine would take years and require massive capital investment, but Marcus now had the legal protections and political support necessary to ensure that Silas's discovery benefited the community the old prospector had called home. Mining operations would create hundreds of jobs in Millfield, generating tax revenue that could rebuild schools, infrastructure, and the economic foundation that had been eroding since the copper refinery closed. Emma started taking advanced geology classes at the state university, her interest in earth sciences sparked by her family's battle for the mine. Diego established a rock and mineral club at his elementary school, teaching other children about geological formations and the patient work required to understand the Earth's hidden treasures. Marcus found himself transformed from a struggling widower into the director of Colorado's most promising mining operation. But the responsibility came with challenges that money couldn't solve. Managing a $300 million development project required skills and knowledge that he'd have to learn while building the operation, all while ensuring that the community benefits Silas had envisioned actually materialized. Attorney Walsh helped Marcus establish the Esperanza Community Foundation, a legal structure that would guarantee local benefits from the mining operation regardless of corporate ownership changes or economic pressures. Half of the mine's profits would support education, infrastructure, and economic development in Millfield, ensuring that Silas's vision of community prosperity became permanent reality. The first diamonds were extracted 18 months after the legal battle ended, rough stones that would be cut and polished into gems worth millions of dollars in international markets. But Marcus insisted that some of the finest stones be retained for a community museum that would tell the story of Silas's discovery and the battle to protect it from corporate theft. Investigative journalist Catherine Walsh won a Pulitzer Prize for her exposure of the mining rights fraud, but she continued investigating similar cases across the American West. Her work led to federal legislation strengthening protections for small property owners facing regulatory pressure from corporate interests. Derek Henderson served 18 months in federal prison before being released to community service and financial restitution. The Henderson family construction business collapsed under the weight of legal settlements and criminal prosecutions, ending 3 generations of political influence in Millfield. Apex Mining Corporation paid over $50 million in fines and settlements, with several executives receiving prison sentences for fraud and conspiracy. The company's acquisition strategy was exposed as systematic theft that had victimized hundreds of property owners across multiple states. But the transformation that mattered most to Marcus was personal rather than financial. His children had learned that standing up for what's right sometimes requires risking everything you have, that truth is more powerful than money when people have the courage to fight for it. They'd seen their father evolve from a struggling widower into a community leader, proving that ordinary people can triumph over systematic corruption when they refuse to surrender their principles. The Esperanza mine became a symbol of resistance against corporate manipulation, inspiring similar battles across the American West as property owners learned that they didn't have to accept regulatory intimidation quietly. Marcus's victory showed that David could still defeat Goliath when armed with truth, determination, and the support of people who believed in justice. 5 years after inheriting what everyone thought was a worthless hole in the ground, Marcus stood in the main shaft of the Esperanza mine, watching his daughter Emma explain geological formations to a group of visiting scientists. Diego was leading a tour of elementary school children, teaching them about minerals and crystals, with the enthusiasm that had made him Millfield's youngest geological expert. The mine employed over 200 people directly, with hundreds more working in support businesses that had opened to serve the operation. Millfield had been transformed from a dying mountain town into a thriving community, where young people could build careers without leaving home, where families could afford decent housing and good schools for their children. Silas's cabin had been preserved as a historical site, his maps and geological charts displayed for visitors who wanted to understand how one man's patient work and careful stewardship had created prosperity for an entire community. The bronze plaque at the cabin entrance bore the inscription that Marcus had chosen: Silas Rivera, 1932 to 2019. He taught us that the greatest treasures are those we share. Marcus often visited the cabin in the evenings, sitting in the chair where Silas had planned his discovery, and plotted his careful strategy for protecting it from those who would exploit it without regard for community benefit. The old prospector had understood something that corporate executives never learned. True wealth comes not from hoarding resources, but from using them to build something lasting for future generations. The mine's success had attracted attention from mining companies around the world, many offering to purchase Marcus's operation for sums that would make him one of Colorado's wealthiest individuals. But he'd learned from Silas's example that some things were more valuable than money, that stewardship was a responsibility that couldn't be sold to the highest bidder. Emma was studying to become a geological engineer, planning to return to Millfield after college to help manage the mine's expansion into other promising formations that Silas's surveys had identified. Diego wanted to become a teacher, sharing his love of geology with children who might discover their own passion for understanding the Earth's hidden secrets. The family that had once struggled to afford basic necessities now had resources beyond anything Marcus had imagined possible, but their fundamental values remained unchanged. They lived in the same house on Elm Street, shopped at the same local stores, and maintained the friendships that had sustained them through their darkest period. Maria's memory remained central to everything they accomplished, her courage during her final battle, inspiring Marcus's determination to honor Silas's legacy and protect their community from those who would exploit it. Her photograph occupied a place of honor in Marcus's office at the mine, a reminder that love and sacrifice create foundations stronger than any geological formation. The Henderson family had moved away from Millfield after their legal and financial disasters, but their former neighbors harbored no bitterness toward people who'd made mistakes under pressure from forces they couldn't control. The community had learned that forgiveness was stronger than revenge, that building the future mattered more than punishing the past. Marcus's story became a legend in Millfield and beyond, told to children as an example of how persistence and principle could triumph over corruption and greed. But he knew the real heroes were Silas, who'd spent 20 years preparing for a battle he'd never lived to see, and Maria, whose love had given him the strength to fight for their children's future. The Esperanza mine continued producing diamonds that sparkled in jewelry stores around the world, but its greatest treasure was the proof it offered that ordinary people could stand up to extraordinary pressure and emerge victorious. Sometimes what looks like a curse is actually a carefully disguised blessing, waiting for the right person to recognize its true value. As Marcus locked up his office and prepared to drive home to his family, he reflected on the journey that had brought them from desperation to prosperity, from mockery to respect, from fear to hope. The mine would continue operating for decades, possibly centuries, creating wealth and opportunity for generations not yet born. But the real victory wasn't measured in dollars or diamonds. It was measured in the knowledge that truth could still triumph over deception, that communities could still protect themselves from exploitation, that families could still build futures based on love and determination rather than money and influence. The mountain that had hidden Silas's secret for so long stood silhouetted against the evening sky, its peaks touched with gold from the setting sun. Somewhere in those depths, other treasures waited for discovery by people patient enough to search and brave enough to fight for what they found. Marcus drove down the mountain toward Millfield's lights, carrying with him the satisfaction of a man who'd honored his obligations to the past while securing possibilities for the future. The hole in the ground that everyone had mocked had become the foundation for dreams that would outlive everyone who doubted their value. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.